Hi, everyone, and welcome to the very first installment of our Intro to Strategic Planning and our very first workshop of 2023. I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us today. We're really excited to host this crash course in strategic planning as part of our Integral Intro series, where we give overviews of key areas of nonprofit management that Integral Org specializes in. So my name is Liz Tang. I use the pronoun she, her, and I'm the program coordinator for Integral Org. I'll be around to host and monitor the chat and do other tech things. But without further ado, we'll advance on to our land acknowledgement. If you could, Mike. Thank you. So we find it's really important to acknowledge that what we call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territory of many peoples presently subject to Treaties 6, 7, and 8, namely the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Kainai, Piikani, Siksika, the Cree, Dene, Sato, Nakota Sioux, Stoney Nakoda, and the Tsuut'ina Nation and the Métis people of Alberta. This includes the Métis settlements and the 6 regions of the Métis Nation of Alberta within the historical Northwest Métis homeland. And we respect the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First People of Canada's who have lived in and cared for these lands for generations. And we are very grateful for the traditional knowledge keepers and elders who are still with us today and those who have gone before us. And we do make this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation and deep gratitude to those whose territory we reside and work on today. I'm very happy to introduce today's facilitator. This is Mike Grogan, President and CEO of Integral Org. And from board governance to strategy development and sustainability planning, Mike has over 30 years of experience where he's recognized for his ability to inspire nonprofit organizations to tackle complex issues and create impactful and lasting solutions that fit the changing needs of their organizations. So as I said, I'll be around for the duration of the workshop. You can always message me on the chat if you need any sort of support. And thank you and enjoy the session.
Well, thank you, Liz, and thanks for getting us going. And again, copy or echo Liz's Happy New Year to you all. It's always to me a privilege to have folks join us for these sessions and to your interest and your questions, your thoughts, your rebuttals, perhaps what I say. Always good stuff to have out there. And this is a session for you. So if there are questions, please do bring them up. I'll present some stuff. It's a lot to cover. We won't leave you hanging. Make sure that if we don't get to something, we should send that out to you. But it's wonderful to see the range of organizations, from big organizations, small, all across the province, and all kind of wrestling with that question, where are we today and where are we going to go? And that's really what, when we talk about strategy, is going from A to B, A being perhaps where we are today, and B being some point in the future, and what's the path to get there. And it can be complex, it can be easy, it can be all kinds of things. And we'll unpack that a bit today and hopefully have some conversation around some of the different elements of what we do in terms of developing strategy. Just in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to sort of understand those components of what maybe go into a strategic planning process. Again, there's lots of ways to do this. There's no one right way. There's no one way that everybody's going to use. But what are some of the basic ones we're seeing out there? What are some of the things that perhaps that we use in Integral Org, that some of the agencies we work with use, perhaps that you use, and we need to know what those pieces are, and what we do when it's a changing environment. And maybe the environment's calming a little bit, but I think still it's a little messy out there right now. And so how do we sort of work with strategically in a time when it's kind of in flux? We'll give you some tools, some processes. We'll give you some things that are very practical. We'll leave you with a great planning template, hopefully, to come out of this with, and then where to go if you have more questions. And then sort of how do you keep strategy front and center? So, we can spend a lot of time. We do spend a lot of time with agencies and organizations in the strategy development process. Here's, going through strat planning is a thing that most organizations do at some point. It does if it done well, energize people and focus people. But a lot of times it sort of falls off. Once you get the plan written, it sort of sits there for 3 more years. You think, we need a strat plan. So we'll try and find ways to avoid that, because that doesn't necessarily, there's still benefits to that. There's always benefits to laying out a plan and engaging people, but there's probably more value in actually how you make this a dynamic and living and fluid document that you can use to actually guide your work. So we'll walk through some of that stuff and figure out where we're going to go with the rest here. So to start us off then, I just want to give you some thoughts about where things are at perhaps today for us, and sort of guiding thoughts. Strategy really is about making choices. It's about, choosing, I think, what courses of action we can do. There is no one right way to get to that sort of magical place of delivering on our mission. So when we talk about that, we got to make some choices. But making choices when things are in flux are it's really challenging. So, 2 years ago, when we're in sort of the midst of COVID, or a year ago even perhaps, that we were sort of talking strategically about 6-month windows, that we were thinking that, that's about as far as you can sort of think ahead right now. I think we're coming beyond that now. I think we're starting to see that we're getting a little more, security in what we're thinking for the future. We're now back to 3-year plans, I think, is kind of our standard. There's no magic to what the time frame is. 3, 6, however you want to write a plan. Some are very, very long, some are shorter. So whatever fits you. There are ways to move forward. So recognizing if we're stuck, if it was uncertain out there, there are some paths to moving forward, even that is in kind of little steps. Just as we come out of COVID, though, and come out of perhaps into a recovery, which I think we are well into right now, certainly economically, starting to see some of that socially, that recovery does not mean restoration. So when we talk about sort of working strategically, that mindset of are we going to go back to the way it was? I'm not quite sure that's the case. For some organizations, it may well be. If sort of the core is intact and your funding is intact and the things you're dealing with in society have stayed the same, perhaps there is a sense of normalcy. But for many organizations, there probably is a bit of a reset here in terms of how we do our work, where we do our work, how much money we'll have to do our work, where that money will come from. There's lots of changes out there right now. So some of the things that were perhaps weak in organizations before, or weak in the system of nonprofits, the sector itself, those are still under challenges. So if you had a funding model that was challenged before the pandemic, it's unlikely that the next couple of years are going to really sort of strengthen that out again, unless you make some different choices. And one of the things about strategy that I think we need to talk a lot about is saying no. It's probably the harder part of strategy. When I say, there's lots of ways to meet your mission, that's certainly true. But one of the temptations we have of nonprofits sometimes is that we like to keep their options open. That if we get a grant over here, well, then that becomes somehow strategic. Or if an opportunity arises somewhere else, well, we don't want to keep that. We don't want to limit ourselves. And there's some benefits to that. There's certainly some things that you can speak to say that is not a bad solution. But it doesn't tend to focus you. I mean, it tends to keep us very broad and sort of blown about by sort of whatever the opportunities are. So how do we say no to things? And how do we say sometimes no to very good things that are good for us or work for a long time? Those are all part of the strategy process, is actually wrestling with those kind of questions. So we'll walk through some options for that, how we sort of think about engaging such things. First question sort of is, why do I actually need a strategy? Like, why do I need one? Some people talk about it. Some people use strategy a lot, but can you not just sort of go day to day, advance your mission, get your money, keep things going? And I think in some cases you certainly can. But there are some advantages to sort of at least thinking this through. Whether you come with a big, complex strategic plan, these do not have to be sort of dozens and hundreds of pages long. They can be quite straightforward. But what does strategy actually do for us? And to me, I'll use lots of quotes through our presentation today. It's what you do today is going to create tomorrow. And the idea that, tomorrow is likely going to happen by itself, whether we create it or not. But, what point do we have in sort of, shaping that reality and shaping that destiny and making sure that we're working in sense we want to go in the way that we want to go forward with. So recognize that there's lots of ways to do strategy. It's really going to depend a lot upon a number of factors. Like, you don't have to follow one process. Find a process that fits you. I mean, I would recommend using a process, using something that does give you some sense of guidance, some sense of structure, that challenges you. I think a lot of what we do in strategy here is to challenge organizations. We don't actually create strategy when we work with groups. We draw that out of groups. But our role is to clarify, to get process, to challenge them on assumptions sometimes, to push back on things that we might say, is this what you really want to do? So using either a process or a group or somebody to sort of help you challenge some of your assumptions is really good. But it's going to depend on the type of organization you are and how you're structured, how long you've been around. So if you're a very small organization, perhaps your process is different than those really large. You have complexity, you're working in multiple locations, multiple different program areas. I think those sometimes processes change how you do strategy, because you got to have an understanding of the organization in a way that's different than perhaps, single service organizations. The type of funding and structures you have in place. If you're entirely a government funded organization, the type of strategy you might do will be very different if you're entirely philanthropically funded, if you're relying on social enterprises or commercial activities. The strategy you'll use will be very different. So their funding model, which can be tied to your program model, obviously. But that's going to determine the type of strategy and the type of process you use to get to your strategy. Types of stakeholders. The question that always arises is, who should be involved in this process? Is it staff? Is it board? Are the clients? Do we bring in sort of past participants? Do we go to our funders? Do we go to people in the community who might know us? No one right or wrong answer again to that. It depends on, what you want to accomplish. Sometimes you get great information for engaging more stakeholders. Sometimes it's not so much the information you get as just sort of getting them to be a part of your process and feeling a part of your organization. So it may not be the content as much as that feeling as I'm helping you craft something. Again, a very sort of specific circumstance for your organization as to what you want to do. And then again, the external operating environment, the world we work within. We don't work in a vacuum. We work in terms of, we are out in sort of community and funding models and different things. So what's happening out there, that's going to affect the process we use. And again, as things become a little clearer, a little more stable in our environment right now, we tend to move towards, I think, longer cycles of planning. So again, as uncertainty, and one of the rules of thumb on that is that as uncertainty increases, the length of our planning timeframes decrease. So, that's one of the things that we're seeing right now. Uncertainty, I think, is waning a bit right now. We're starting to see a little more certainty out there, starting to go to longer planning frames. One of the premises we'll work with is that the effective strategy needs to be inclusive, clear, and focused. So it is to include different voices. It is to include different thoughts in the process that perhaps aren't ones that we're necessarily wanting to hear sometimes. There's a nice line from Stanford University, has lots of free planning resources for nonprofits. And one of the lines they use that we sometimes incorporate in our work is, do not fall in love with the image you have of yourself. And it speaks to the idea that you should be proud of what you do, but don't just sort of think the way I'm doing it is the only way to do this work. So when we're open to sort of different voices, we're inclusive of their opinions, I think it challenges some of those assumptions, those views we have of ourselves, so that we can come up with a better pathway forward. And this really much is a team game. I think strategy is a team sport. It's about governance, about management, it's about operations, staff, volunteers, perhaps others in that mix. So that it really is, they need to be aligned together. So this isn't strategy from on high, where you have one or two people say, this is where we're going to go. It doesn't tend to work. We're usually not that smart to do that. You need more voices. People don't tend to support what they have not created themselves, so are been a part of the creation anyway. So how do you make that? How do you sort of incorporate all these different parts that make up the nonprofit operating model and sort of bring that to the process? And at the end of the day, what we end up with this is a nice little definition of what a strategy actually is it's a coordinated set of actions designed to create and sustain a competitive advantage in achieving our missions. I like a couple of pieces of this, and then there's one piece that's a little tricky, I think, for us. One is that is that coordinated set. Now, you don't just write one piece and it sits apart from something else. You have strategies that interlock with each other, that support each other. Maybe they work in different areas, but there is some semblance of why we're picking these 3 or 4 or 5 areas and not the 5 or 10 others that we could have chosen. And the line in this definition that I think is sometimes maybe challenging to some folks is the idea that it's strategy about creating and sustaining a competitive advantage. That's not language that sometimes gets used a lot in nonprofits, that we're going to be a competitive advantage. We're going to find what makes us different. But as we look forward into the industries we work within, it is important that we set ourselves apart. We'll give you a little trivia question here about how many nonprofits work in this province or are operating in this province right now, registered in this province at least, to see how crowded this space is. If we can't set ourselves apart, realize that there are other ways that those missions, our missions, we think are ours, can be achieved, and will we have public support for such things? So we're going to do a little poll here to start going, just to get a pulse check. There's no right or wrong answer here. Liz is going to launch a poll. We're going to ask you the question, does your organization currently have a strategic plan that meaningfully guides your work? Meaningfully guiding the work is important in this. You got 3 answers, not at all, don't have it, somewhat, yeah, I kind of got it. Have to reconcile meaningfully in that sense. And oh yeah, we use it all the time. So some not at all, about 25% say not at all. We don't have a plan, doesn't guide our work. Fair enough. Somewhat, 50%. I would say a fairly common, well, the most common in this case, nonprofit answer. Yeah, we got a strategy, maybe a little outdated. Maybe we don't quite use it enough. Maybe we bump into it every now and then, or maybe a few years ago rewrite it. And we use it all the time. Great, excellent stuff. So again, no one right or wrong answer there. It's not a report card, right? It's just figuring out where you're at with this, what's important to you. At different stages of your life, you'll have different needs for strategy. And again, back to the sort of who you are and what you do. When we talk about what strategy does, though, and there's a lot of ways again to frame this, but it does identify and articulate your focus and priorities. It does say something. This is who we are. This is what we're doing, where we're going. There's other components to it, certainly mission and vision, maybe your purpose statements, depending on how you sort of defined your work. But it does it gives that sense of identifying and articulating what you're about. So, and it does that in a way that creates for a common understanding of it. So, third bullet point, a little out of order here, but the idea that you're not just one person knowing where we're going, that you've got everybody on the same page. It is a playbook where we all read from the playbook and say, I know where we're going in each of these plays. And it's really important that it is a sort of team sport again in that sense, that we're working towards those common goals. It allows you to be efficient, to make your decisions on where energy and activities are to be allocated in your organization. With resources being scarce, we want to make sure that the things that we do are actually aligned towards a purpose, not just something we've done for decades, or we've always been a pet project of somebody, or we think it works. That if in a time of scarcity, perhaps, want to make sure the things we're doing really do focus us towards those ends. Again, establishing agreement about your outcomes, where we're going to go. We know we want to head this direction. We will sort of take our best guess at how to get there. There's nothing in strategy, when we write strategies, that says we know how things are going to work out. If you had written a strategy about 3 years ago, or just finished your strat plan, it's unlikely that your strategy worked really well over the last 3 years. We didn't know COVID was going to be upon us in the way that it did. So you do your best guess. You sort of say, this is where we're going. We know we want to go. These are the activities we think are going to get us there. But you got to readjust when things change. And so how do you sort of start with that common understanding where we're going, and then build in a process about how to adjust when you're there? And that's that idea of how you change when the situation around you changes. And that can be both internal and external. You might run a plan, and all of a sudden you've had the CEO go and some staff turnover, or something change in the organization, and say, we got to pause this stuff now because we got to sort of get back and build our house again before we can keep moving forward in this. Or perhaps it's something external where, all of a sudden a funding source that was there is gone. And now we got to think, okay, there's something we got to reassess in that. So strategy does some of those things. It doesn't solve them all, but at least it gives some tools to work with understanding and clarifying and aligning different pieces of the process. And so the planning process is us. It's a tool, an organizational management process to determine where you're going, the actions you need to make progress, and how you know it's successful. It's from A to B. We're going from here to there. Here's how we're going to get there. How do we know we did that? And again, it's not a report card. It's saying we took our best shot at it. We knew what we were going to do. Then we adjusted along the way and hopefully made progress towards our goals. So the process itself, there's a ton of processes out there. There's templates, there's tools. We'll give you some, we'll give you resources to others. We can always talk about what we do and how we do it here. We're really flexible. We work with a whole bunch of different ways of dealing with different sizes of organizations, but finding one that works for you, right? That works for your staff, works for your board, works for your stakeholders. That it adds value. And again, that idea of being disciplined and having some objective structure, at least, if not sort of more personalized content that challenges you along the way, is really, really important. So if we just do the things that we think we want to do, we need something that probably pushes us beyond that. But remember that planning and plans are means to an end. They're not ends of themselves. They take a lot of work sometimes. They can be, I think, sometimes very energizing if done well, kind of frustrating if not done well. But they're supposed to get you somewhere. They're not just a tick on the box saying, we did a strat plan, done, see you 3 years from now. We'll go back to it again. They should bring some value in terms along the process between. So some of the processes, again, lots of ways to do this, but I think there's some elements that are pretty common to many planning processes. It'll be that cycle of preparing your organization. Before you even start planning, you got to kind of sort of till the soil a bit. Are we ready to go? Have we got the information we need? All those kind of things. There's some visioning, some planning, some evaluations. I'll unpack some of these in different ways here. We like to put in I think there's always a good need to understand the current state of your organization, the industry you work within, whether that's the nonprofit sector writ large or a subsector of the nonprofit world, or even that you might work in industries that have private offerings or public offerings too. Who are you out there competing with, aligned with, perhaps reliant upon for your work. And then the external operating environment, what's sort of coming up in the world up ahead of us here? And there's some tools we'll give you to do that. And then defining that desired future, establishing priorities, goals, action steps, lots of ways to term those things. And we'll give you, I think, a really nice template at the end here to work with that gives you some of that concrete value of this stuff. And then what are the processes and timelines for evaluation and revision? That tends to sometimes drop off a lot of plans, but when are you going to come back to this? How are you going to know that you're making progress? When does the staff or the board or the staff and board collectively come back and say, okay, we're a year in, is this really where we're sitting? Has things changed? And so how do you make sure you're always using this in a dynamic way that's not something that you look at 3 years from now or 5 years from now and say, yeah, we never really got to that one, which is quite a common piece when we look back, when we do planning. We have people look back at their past plan. A lot of times you're going to hear, well, we didn't really do that one. So fair enough, you don't need to, but it's like, did you choose not to do that along the way, or just sort of did it just fall off? And those are two really different situations. So when we talk about clarifying your current state, it's sort of understanding the strengths and development areas in your governance management operations. Every organization probably does need to assess where they're at. And I will give you tools for each of these as we move forward here. But it's taking that sort of foundational pick. Who are we and where are we at? What am I doing before I start? Who am I in this process? And where am I strong? Where do I need to do some development work? Understanding the external environment, sort of the trends, dynamics, what's coming up the next 3, 5, 10 years, whatever your time frame might be, even beyond your plan. So you might want to think about the political trends in Alberta. Okay, we got an election coming up, got some different divisive issues. Federally, there'll be election in 2 years, 2.5 years, but perhaps what it is. So you know that sometimes those drive your planning processes. Sometimes you'll look at things in the economy, different ways of doing that. We'll play with some of these topics later on today here. But what are those trends that might affect you even beyond the length of your plan? There's something changing 10 years out. I did a session on governance for folks who are gas producers. For them, it's the shift to electric vehicles in the next 10 or 20 years. Well, that's going to probably affect the demand for their product, not the next couple of years, perhaps, but 10 years out. That's something they're starting to lay the groundwork for in this round of strategy. Being clear about the industry you work within. We don't tend to talk industry sometime in nonprofit, but it's a really important thing. None of us are unique. There's a lot of nonprofits in this province, but who are your clients? Who are the competitors? Who are complements? Who are substitutes? Who are collaborators in your process? There's a mix in the industry that we have that we don't stand alone. We don't work in that vacuum. Discerning that future elements, where are we going to be? So once you sort of get that sense of who we are, where we work in the industry, where do we want to go? What's that process? Okay, sometimes it's really sort of, blue ocean. I can sail anywhere I want. Usually it's not, because we have missions. So for some of us, we have charitable purposes, which narrow that down. There's always restrictions in terms of the resources we have and those kind of things. So, how do we make some choices? How do we decide this? It says 3 years on there, the asterisk. Again, there's no magic numbers. Sometimes 3 is a nice one because it's far enough away that gives us time to build some things and to make some real choices, to build some change out. But it's also not so far out that we're really speculating where it's going to be. Like to say I'm writing a plan that's 10 years out, I struggle with that. I don't know where I'm going to be in 10 years. I don't know where the organization is going to be in 10 years. So it's a trickier one. If you've got some really big things you're shifting, perhaps that's viable and that's a good, legitimate way to go forward. So, but don't get locked into a number. It's not the most important thing. And sometimes you might get to 3 years in a plan and say, yeah, these 3 or 5 areas of strategy are still the ones we want to focus on. Bit of a rewrite, and you're off and going again. Nothing wrong with that at all. And then how do you sort of break a big strategy down into sort of bite-sized pieces? And we'll walk through that as well. That's kind of the process. This is a graphic that we use. If I can click it here. There we go. And this is just a bit of I think it speaks to the messiness of the process, but also within some structure. The idea that this is a funnel for, you think about how we develop strategy or how strategy gets developed. And it sort of starts with that, very wide end to the left. I guess I don't know where you're looking. Sure. Same screen, I guess. Sure. The idea that end of the funnel is really wide, and you're getting a lot of thoughts in there, different bubbles, different colors of bubbles. They're not all kind of the same. You're getting different ideas. Some are really good, some are bad, some are half baked, some are really out there. That's really good. You want that stuff. You want to build some awareness, gather information, get some insights out there. That's the inclusive part of strategy, where it's kind of messy. Doesn't seem like you're getting anywhere. You're putting a lot of stuff on the table. And that can be frustrating for some, saying, if I want to just get to the end of this process and tell me what we're doing, that's a little tougher at this end. But that's the generative part of strategy, where you've got some options, you're wrestling with things. That's why you need to be sort of this broader base of have people involved than just one or two people. So you get those ideas on the table. But as you move forward, it's not just about collecting the ideas, it's about distilling them down, linking them together, synthesizing these things, envisioning the future and see how they might work. And you start to lose some of those. We start to narrow the funnel down. Some of the variations in the different dots, sizes, and colors start to disappear a bit. And as we work through to strategy and then on into actions at the pointy end of the funnel here, you're starting to get real concrete goals. We've got some different strategies, 2 or 3 different colors. We're not sort of all over the place. We've defined some boundaries and we've narrowed it down. We have said no to some things probably in here. And then from that, we can define our actions. And whether you do that on an annual basis or 6-month basis, whether departments do that, it really depends on your organization. But you start from this really broad to the narrow, and within that are some pretty defined levels of activity. So I want to talk a bit about just some of these elements I talked about, the different pieces of strategy that we tend to go through. So how to be clear about your current and expected capacity to operate. So kind of twofold, that little sort of self-assessment perhaps of where we are today. Where do we have our needs? What's strong here? And this is really important. We've done work for organizations where they've come in and asked us to do a bit of a, maybe add a new program area for them, help them plan that out, do some feasibility work, maybe some development work. And you might get into that process and you realize, boy, it's just not quite working here, the work we're doing. And you sort of go back and we do a bit of an assessment with them. We've got a tool, and I'll show you a couple different ones here, that you realize, oh boy, you're not ready to add a new program because you're almost bankrupt and your board's quit and no one knows who you are. So better course is go back and sort of say, okay, let's build the foundation of the house before we add this second story to you. And so having that sort of objective look at your current and perhaps expected. If you know there's big changes coming in the next year, you've got a big retirement coming, your board's going to turn over, you've got a move on the go or something like that, or you're already adding a new program, those sort of will change your capacity to do work. And it's important you're really clear about that and have a common understanding of that. So you're all on the same page to start with. So, it's just understanding that capacity or operational governance and strategic capacity is a good first step. Who are we today? Where am I? I'm going to start this journey and take stock of who I am. Ongoing assessment, and the idea that you don't just do that once, you probably need to sort of take a stock of how am I today. It's a bit like a health kind of thing. Am I able to keep sort of going on the journey today as I sort of check in? Lots of ways to do that, informally and formally. Some stuff you'll know if you're running organizations, you're on boards, you get a sense of where you're strong and where you're weak, but to sort of go through a process where everybody gets to know that. So this is a SWOT for many folks who've done strategy. SWOT, strength, weakness, opportunity, and threats, is kind of the basic kind of way of doing that little self-assessment. Where are you best? What do you do well? What are our strengths? What are our weaknesses? We might call that development areas. What do we want to sort of work on? We're not as strong in. So really sort of open-ended kind of questions. Can do this in a board meeting, staff meeting, collectively, list them out and sort of say, this is where we think we're strong, this is where we're weak. The challenge with this is when you're sort of sitting around a table and you've got the board there and no one's going to say, yeah, the board's weak, or maybe it's harder to say that. They might do some tune-up stuff. So do you really get an honest assessment? So it does have some limitations, the way depending how you do it. Opportunities and threats are good. Opportunities are more external. So strength and weaknesses kind of internal to the organization. Opportunities and threats can be external things. What's out there we could do? What are the threats that might hinder our existence? So a nice, very straightforward, easy to facilitate, does not need to be external to do this kind of work for you. Gives you that sense of where we're at, but probably lacks a little bit of depth, perhaps, because you're not probably as objective on some of these pieces when you're doing it. The piece that we use, and this is one that we do as part of our process. It's an organizational assessment tool. We customize these. There's up to about 80 or so questions. Agree to strongly disagree that sort of range of questions. It's a self-assessment. It's not ours. It goes to board and staff. We break it down by different functional areas of governance, management, communications, technology, finance, all those things, and just gives you an idea. And why we like this one a lot is it sometimes it's not so much of you get some variations where the board thinks we're great financially, the staff knows you're going bankrupt. Probably need to sort of reconcile this before we move forward. Is it a big issue? Is it a communications issue? Are we missing some information? Is it true for one side or the other? So those are things we like to do. This is a tool, though, that we're hoping to make open access. We have a goal, and we're applying for some funding right now to put this up online. to make so you can go in at any time, set up a profile for your organization, have it sent out to your board, staff, whoever you choose. Information comes back and report just to you. We don't get to see it unless you choose to share it with us. But it give you that benchmark, sort of baseline information about where we're at. And I think every organization probably should do something every once a year, sort of that checking in, little health checkup, like going to the doctor kind of thing. Where are we strong? Where do some tests on ourselves and have creating that common understanding. So hopefully within the next, I don't know, 6-8 months, we're going to secure that. Maybe got a good application in or what to have it in. And this would be something you can do. And then part of our model will be that if you choose to share with ourselves or other capacity builders or funders, then share your report with them and say, hey, I need some help in governance. No, I need some help in strategy. I need some funding for this. It gives you a tool to not just develop your own organization in governance or management or operations, but perhaps use other people to help them support you in that journey as well. But if you're looking at what we do now, we do these as part of our planning process. We'll do them one-off if they're of interest to you. A bit of a fee for service, but they're not overly pricey, these ones. Know the industry you work within. So we've sort of got that sense of, okay, here's who we are. Here's what's the industry you're working in? What's this nonprofit world we're working within? So we're gonna do a quick poll right now. And so when we talk about the industry, there's a few ways to slice this, but I want to talk about how many nonprofits are currently active in Alberta. In the chat, type in a number, how many nonprofits are active in Alberta? If you got some, just throw a number, well, throw it, if you know the answer, put it in. If you don't, throw a number in. I like to see where we're at. I have to look at those things.
500, 4,000.
Oh,
26,000. I loved, we haven't really had this question as an open answer. So
yeah, it's all over the place. So 15 from the low hundreds to some fives, 26 being high thus far. Excellent. Excellent in the sense they're good answers, poor in the sense they're wrong. But okay. Yeah, I live in BC, 3,000. There we go. Yeah. So we'll stop. I'm going to stop reading those things. We have 50. Is that 50,000? Where do you go, Anthony? Yeah. Someday we'll dominate the world like that. Right now, and just a caveat, stats for numbers of nonprofits active in Alberta are a little sketchy. Stats on anything in nonprofits are sketchy in terms of data. It's not the thing. CCBO has a great report out, though, just for this Too Essential to Fail. It was a report, some good facts about the sector. Be careful again, just these are drawn in a very specific kind of way. Over 30,000 nonprofits registered in Alberta right now. And that's just the ones registered in Alberta. You can have ones registered federally that operate here as well, that probably aren't on this list. So there's a lot of nonprofits in Alberta. So when we talk about the industry you work within, recognize we work in a very crowded industry. Again, data is tough across this country and across the world. I would surmise, though, and this is just a guess, an educated guess, that we have more nonprofits per capita than anywhere else in the world. So we have a lot of nonprofits in Alberta, very entrepreneurial. There's very low barriers to starting a nonprofit, easy to start, hard to sustain, lots of them out there. So recognize that we're in a really crowded field. And when you talk about that idea of creating a competitive advantage, there's a lot of pieces that you're competing against people not only in this sector, but people outside the sector as well in some situations. So where they sit, this is again, so if you're sort of thinking, okay, who am I? Where's my industry? What do I work within? This is kind of the breakdown of where the general subsectors that people work within in Alberta. Lots of religious organizations. That's kind of declining a bit. Probably 10 or 15 years, 20 years ago, you might be over 25%. Sometimes some shifts in that sort of subsector, but also some consolidation as maybe small rural churches are consolidating into bigger denominations, perhaps. Lots of sports and rec, fundraising and funding. It's kind of a big one in that sense. Social services, support services, different ways. So it breaks down there. Recognize that no one's alone in this world. Even if you're in education, 2% of the market, you're still looking at hundreds and hundreds of organizations in that space. Okay. And so when we talk about an industry analysis, and again, there's some tools out there. It's just understanding, who else out there is in your world. So we like to think we're unique, and we like to think we all do good work, when that's very true. I think the good work anyway, not so much the uniqueness. But it's good for us to be aware, both for our own knowledge, but we're making a case for funding, perhaps saying you always got to ask, who else is doing this work? Probably good to have an educated answer about who's doing this work in our world. So some of the questions you might want to ask on these things. Stanford, again, is a great source for this. They do have a great industry analysis tool. Stanford. What are your primary areas of activity? And then, what's going to happen to demand for your stuff? So you start taking a look again at your own model, the stuff you do, But who else is offering these services that are similar? How do you compare to those? Do you have a better access? Do you have better marketing? Do you offer a better program than them? Do you offer a better fee structure than them? So it's being honest about, how do your programs and your activities stack up against somebody else's? And sometimes it's hard to figure that out because you don't necessarily know everything about them. But it's good to have that exercise to say, okay, I see there's 3 other places that people can go. Why would they choose to come to our organization versus somebody else's? Are there barriers? Can somebody start something new? You may start a program and all of a sudden, boom, next week there's a new nonprofit. Every year in Alberta, we incorporate in Alberta alone about 1,200 new nonprofit organizations. That's a ton of new nonprofits every year. Most of them don't last. After about 6 years, half of them are gone. But the idea that there's always new players in the system. So what's the barrier, if any, from people starting into your space? What relationships do you need? What future opportunities and challenges? So again, some nice templates for this, but understand the world you work within, and then the idea of who else is out there in this space. The external environment, sort of the third component. We've done the internal, we sort of talked the industry. Now we're talking about what are the trends out there that we perhaps might want to take a look at in terms of our own operating environment. So again, some easy ways to do this. A PEST, SWOT was the internal sort of one before. PEST is a standard, taking a look around at the world out there. Again, a simple, straightforward way of doing it. You can go far more extensive. You can do lots of research and get some great material from just getting folks out there and engaging in different ways. But what are the political, economic, social, technological trends? You could add environmental to this. You could add other domains, perhaps really easily. That might affect your work moving forward. So we've done strategy work for even the last change of government. We went from the NDP to the UCP. We were in a group before that was working in an area that was very much aligned with the NDP model. Once the UCP came in, the entire funding stream shifted. They went from an organization that was going to grow dramatically to one that probably was a bit of a status quo by the end of the day. So those shifts, that whether you can anticipate that or not, it's good to take a look at those things. And sometimes it's just what might we do if this stuff happens? And how impactful will each of these trends be for us? How are you going to monitor those trends? What will you do if something does happen? So that idea that, again, we don't work alone, we work out in the system, and how to be aware of that system. So I want you to play with this for a little bit, just for a couple of minutes here. We're going a little slow, but we're going to put a Jamboard in the chat, I believe. Am I saying this, Liz? There's a link in the chat. Okay.
There's a Jamboard link.
Jamboard, but you're going to do is you're going to sort of go through it and you're going to take a look. There's the political realm, economic, social, and technological realm out there. They're just sticky notes. You're just going to type in what might happen as you think through next 5 years, Liz. I think it's our time frame here. What's going to happen in each of those roles. So Liz will explain Google Jamboard for you, and we'll play with this for a few minutes.
Yeah. So this is our Google Jamboard. It is fairly straightforward to use, but what you'll focus on is double clicking on any of these sticky notes to add any words. You don't have to be cryptically short. You can write a good amount in these little things, and then you just press save to save your text on there. We do have 4 factors we want you to pay attention to. So make sure to look at this arrow up top, and then you can shift it to the other 2 factors. Try to enter something in each one of these. We'll give you a short amount of time, and you can always flip back and forth between these 2 frames. So it's pretty straightforward. You can also go back into any of your stickies and edit as you like. So if you have any troubles with this, you are free to enter some help on the chat, and I'll try to get to that. But I'll stop sharing for now, and then in a few minutes.
Actually, you keep sharing.
Yeah?
Why don't you keep sharing? I'll keep sharing. Sort of go through things and what can do there. So there we go. Back up. So even if you can't, hope you can see it. For those who couldn't access it, we'll just keep it sharing here. And I think these are. This is the kind of stuff, right? And sometimes like war in Ukraine, absolutely, right? There's some things there that where things go that will have economic things too. There's one growing really big on that one. Change political parties. Excellent relationship between provincial and federal governments and the willingness to cooperate. These days, the last little while, right? That's huge, right? And do we continue down that path for the next few years where we have perhaps where we're at odds with each other, we're not communicating well, or there's just ideological differences, excellent stuff. I like the bottom one, continued erosion of trust in public sector. I think those are really important. So, what does that do? Is that good or bad for us? Is that good for nonprofits who are not in the public sector, or is it challenging because we get sort of caught up in that? And they're great thoughts, because these are ones for you to sort of wrestle with. And you may not agree with these things, or may not quite see the link instantly, but they're really important to sort of say, okay, let's have a conversation about this. On the economic side, industry changes, less grants, interest rates, right? Or inflation. If there's an economic one right now that is just so challenging for us, it's going to be inflation in so many different ways, from the amount of money people donate, to the costs of running our own organizations, to staffing things. Inflation is huge. Let's go to the next page and see if we did stuff. I don't know if we already got anything. Oh, there's all kinds of stuff. Socially, there's things in there as well. Safe sport could be diversity and inclusion, absolutely, and across any organization, different ways. Continued pushback against DEI. Oh, interesting. That's good. So those kind of things, right? There's not just all, there's things happening and they're not necessarily set in stone. You might have pushback against some DEI kind of stuff. So how do we wrestle with that? How do we incorporate that? Where do we stand on that kind of stuff? Technology, certainly is such a fast moving one. Fundraising through, social media, changing different pieces, data, the risk of breaches and data protection, wrestling with that here, not our own data breach, but policies around that. How do we protect ourselves? Automation, I think, is a fantastic one. The idea that, how much of the work sort of gets automated as we move forward in areas that we didn't think it could be automated. And, being kind of old school, you think, okay, there's some stuff we got automated, but we're very much a people business. But you look what's happened in the oil patch in the last 10 years, and how much they've managed to sort of move away from high labor areas to more automated or that kind of stuff. So great things to have. Again, just a really quick way of sort of engaging this. You can add other things like the environmental component, but it's a way of just sort of thinking beyond your box right now. And how do we bring these back into strategy? Yeah. We're going to turn this one off and go back to me. So I know that we might have the joys of Jamboard. There's always some things there that we need to work through. So do I need to share my screen again, Liz? Or
yes, you do.
Oh, I thought so.
And just as a note to everyone, I'll clean up that little Jamboard and be sending that out for everyone else to look at after the session.
Good. All right. We all good, Liz?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay. Just again, something to think about. Look at the external environment. One way of doing it is the PEST thing, the one we just did. Other ways of doing it. Again, what I like that is just, it's really engageable, right? There's no wrong answers. You don't need to have, when we talk about sort of doing internal work, sometimes the industry work, sometimes it's hard for boards because they say, well, I kind of get what we do, but I don't have enough information to make decisions about this. So you got to find ways to make sure that they're sharing it in appropriate ways. When we talk about trends, everybody has some insights on that. And so in different areas, there's lots of room. That's a really, I think, nicely inclusive way of working. So we've done that. We've moved to the next one. Now we're going to start to think of envisioning the future. Okay, so we've sort of gone through, we understand who we are, we understand the industry, we've got it sort of coming up. What do we do? Like, how do we go? And just, that when we talk about the future, we sort of start with those realities of the world we work within. So it doesn't do us any good to sort of say, okay, we're a $1 million organization or $100,000 organization today, and 3 years from now we're going to be $5 million. There's got to be a reality and a pathway there that says something of what we've just done gives us some hope or some indication, more than hope, that we're going to get there. So that idea, we got to work within the realities of the world we're in. It's good to imagine sort of plausible futures, and sometimes you should think, are we going here, here, or here? When I say that strategy is going from A to B, you might have 16 different variations of B before you pick the one you want. So it's the idea that, okay, now I know where we're going. Now I know the steps to get there, perhaps. But there's not just one future. Even within our mission statements are written pretty broadly a lot of times. They're not necessarily achievable in some cases. So, or nor designed to be. They're about where we're going for sort of enduring problems sometimes. So, but how do we sort of, think about different ways of doing that forward? So multiple scenarios to start with, and then narrowing it down. Again, kind of the funnel thing. Recognize that the decisions you make today are going to really work well into the future, but we don't have a lot of information about the future. That's the challenge of strategy work or doing scenario work, is that you don't really know enough about the future. So you're taking, again, your best guess, you're basing it in some sense of reality, some sense of information, and going from there. But we don't have that knowledge of where the world's going to go. So you're working all those factors into this vision of the future. In most cases, the future is quite well aligned with the past. So if we were writing a strat plan for somebody, it's not like it's 100% different. It's not like you need new things all the time. In fact, that may be an indication that you're not operating as efficiently or effectively, or you're chasing some dollars perhaps. So a lot of times the things you've been doing, if they work well, can certainly be a part of a strategy. And there's a bit of a dynamic, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. But the idea that a lot of times strategy in nonprofits kind of comes down to what you're really good at, you've been good at for a while, and how much money you have or can expect to have. So in those areas, right? And there may be some room for other stuff, but those aren't necessarily non-strategic, but they can be a little bit limiting. So using some sort of prompts to sort of think, okay, what can we do to sort of rethink about what we're currently doing that might be different in the future? So what should we start, stop, continue? Nice, easy one. We're doing this program. Should we go on? Should we not? Should we adjust it? You might want to sort of come up with sort of big, hairy, audacious goal. So that sort of stake in the ground thing, saying, you know, okay, got a great foundation. We got 3 or 4 good programs, but you know, what if in 5 years we are this? We're going to end this problem. This was, you know, in 2005 or so when they started in Calgary, the 10-year plan to end homelessness. We'll end homelessness in 10 years. Came up with a plan, strategies, put a big countdown clock on their website, counting down from 10 years out. About 9 years into it, they took the clock off because they weren't going to make it. And but the point wasn't necessarily going to do that, but it was putting a stake in the ground and pushing their strategies towards such things. Sustainability analysis is a tool we use to sort of think through the program mix you might have. So it's thinking about what do we do now? Does it actually make money for us? Does it align with our mission? So ways to sort of think through what is our operating model and how we're going to get there. Again, be inclusive and involve those for whom the future matters. So this is when we're talking about a future, the language you'll hear, certainly through the diversity world, is nothing for us without us. So if you're creating a future for clients and not involving in the process, and they're not at least vetting at least some of what you're doing, it's hard to create a future for them. And refine it until it works. How do you get something that really is realistic, that's doable, that's both aspirational and inspirational? I think that's really important when you talk about the future, that it's something pushes you a bit, but also really compels people to be involved in your organization. This is a great time when you're saying, we are creating a future here. We really want it to be something that really says, yeah, that rings a bell for people. Going back again to that competitive advantage, that 30,000 nonprofit model. What really says, yeah, that's the group I want to be involved with. I want to give my money. I want to give my time. I want to send my kids there, whatever it might be. So when we talk about creating the plan, so you've kind of brainstormed throughout, there's some tools we can sort of lay with in terms of that. There's a mountain. Okay, there we go. That's what I'm looking at. Just how do we sort of break this down into chunks? We may have said we've got this sort of grand vision. We know where we're going. We're going to be this. In 2025, we will be this. You can write that as a statement, write it as a set of statements. We use the concept of an ambition statement sometimes. By 2025, it will be ... It gives us that grand overall vision for your plan. But how do you break it down? How do you get to different pieces? And if you sort of think of us as a mountain climbing initiative kind of thing, if you think the strategy, that sort of ambition where you're going over the course of the plan is kind of that very top of the mountain. So you look at that flag we got there on the little graphic, you know, that's the route you're going to take. I can see we're going to go up there and in 5 years we'll be at the top of this mountain. Great. Let's break it down a little bit though. So we know we're going to go from camp 1 to camp 2 to camp 3. Perhaps those are sort of the intermediate objectives. We're breaking it down. It's 3-year on this one, I guess. What are the stages along the way? What are the big steps over the next year? So we're going to get to here. From there, we'll get to there. And then the very short-term ones, those actual, you know, day-to-day, I'm looking for a handhold. I'm going to go from here to here, here to here, here to here, and work my way up. So it's taking this very grand overall goal, breaking it into sort of chunks, whether it's time-wise or perhaps it's funding, perhaps it's sort of outcomes type measurements. It's not always just time. But over this period of work to run the plan, what is from that grand vision down into how does this work on a day-to-day basis? So one of the things we put in place here, just checking time. So this is an example. So this is just an example of a plan that we wrote for somebody, pulled it, sanitized a bit. This is one of the ones, and you tend to get sort of areas of strategy. You usually get a people one, usually a funding one, sometimes a profile one, programs that sort of mix of what we do, activities. And then sometimes there's a different kind of one. It's like sort of a bigger goal that doesn't fit in those things. But a lot of strategies fit into those 4 buckets: people, programs, funding, and profile are kind of the ways you sort of see it. And that's really, there's nothing wrong with that. How you get there is very different. So this is one that was an organization that was going to diversify because they needed more discretionary funding. A lot of social enterprise. They had a commercial kitchen and the funding strategy, and then the philanthropic culture. So again, a big sort of, this an intermediate goal, and then here's some of the immediate areas we're going to do to work that out. And then within this sort of this things like the social enterprise one, they'd have a business plan for that. So again, broad down to action steps in each area. In a way you can do that. This is one that is from Bridgespan. Bridgespan's a capacity building research group out of the States. So sometimes you pull materials out of the States. You got to watch for jurisdiction, language stuff. This case, that doesn't apply. Great material. So this is Living into Your Strategic Plan is the document. Bridgespan is the organization. This is a free download. And why I like this one, it's a template that once you've written your plan is to keep it really front and center, right? It's like, that one of the things you hear, and this is, I think, from the report, you hear this collective sigh when you're done the planning process. It's not necessarily fun sometimes. It's a grunt at the end to get things done. We're done. Off we go. But that's actually the easy part. The harder part is how do you keep it active and dynamic and relevant? And so this nice little set of tools gives you something to do that. And really, it's just, a sort of template. They have fillable templates. So it's a little sketchy here in terms of the graphics, but the idea that, how do you translate the goal into action steps? How do you create sort of the idea of breaking it down into, the blueprints, get your team involved, aligning your finances. So it takes each of the pieces to make it happen, to run your strategy to make it happen. So it's one thing to write a strategy to say, well, I'll diversify our funding revenue. Well, great. Well, who's going to do that? By what time? What skills do they need? How does that activity interface with other activities? Do you have the capacity to do both? Are you relying on parts of the organization, like a communications department, to do stuff when the program folks have already got the strategy to max those folks out? So it is a way to align and integrate your plans, but really clear about what you're doing. And so there's just different templates. These are board level dashboards. Each initiative has sort of different ways of the priority, the time frames, who needs to do what, the quarters, kind of things. Again, really adaptable if you're doing something a little more straightforward, make it more complex if you want. But I like it because it's a tool. You don't have to develop these things by yourself. They're out there and they're free to use. Okay, so Bridgespan, I think I'll be in the PowerPoint there. And just how you keep things sort of focused, right? It's like, how do you keep strategy day to day? So it doesn't become something that 3 years later you're thinking, should have done something with that plan. So how do you get folks, when you get staff, to say, okay, what you're doing fits with a strategy? Do you understand? You helped create the strategy as part of those retreat days, whatever. But you see now how this fits with your day-to-day work. If you don't see that, well, that's part of leadership, is to say, I understand why we're doing this work and not just sort of fill in time here. That we embed the priorities and goals as part of both the governance and management processes. The boards see themselves as much as a part of strategy in moving forward than sometimes very involved in creation, but tend to drop off or get sort of reported back to. But what's their role in fulfilling the strategy? And then being disciplined again about revisiting and revising the process. Can't say that enough. Go back to it, learn from what you're doing, and then move forward. So a couple of questions just really quickly to wrap up here that come up. Who leads the process? Can be, this is one that can be staff-led, can be board-led, can be co-led. It can be committee-led. So there's no one answer to that. I like inclusive stuff. I think it needs both board and staff. I like frontline staff or operational staff involved because they know so much about the organization. Sometimes stakeholders, depending on the organization. How long does it take? And these are ones that, there's no magic again to it, but I think that you need to create some momentum. We've got plans that bog down because it's hard to gather people, and you kind of lose that sort of sense of movement, and you got to restart all the time. That's not good. At the same time, you can't rush these things through. You can't do a strat plan in an afternoon. It's just really simple. So it takes time to digest and to percolate and to bring in different ideas. So, 3 months is kind of minimum in my mind. Don't want to go much longer than 6. I think it's a bit long, but it's keeping momentum up. It's sort of, you got to keep that sort of art of the plan development as you move forward. And do we need outside help? Well, absolutely. That's why we're here. Now, you may or may not need outside help. It depends on you, right? I think there's an advantage to that. There are some resources. We do strat planning as a fee for service. We're doing it in a subsidized way, so we're cheaper than some. The Alberta government does some work in this area. There's lots of private consultants. We have people on the board who've done this. Using people who are internal to the organization is hard. Like, I can't do strat planning at INTEGRALIntros because it takes me out of the mix. I sort of bring my voice. You can't lead and provide content very easily. So sometimes that helps. Sometimes the outside help is just a template, though. It's not a person. It's a process and a template that guides you and challenges you. So again, find something that works for you. Again, it's all about conversations. So have those conversations internally, externally. All change begins in conversation. I didn't leave a lot of room for questions today, Liz. Yeah.
That's okay. We only really received one, so
Okay.
if we want to, this was in response to the point of adjusting your sort of planning with different time frames. And the question was, where is it? Does the shorter length of planning time frames also apply to budgets? Maybe it's also a general question about how budgets play into strategic plans.
Yeah, no, that's a good question because again, it's the idea that sometimes your planning is sort of dependent on how much money you have. So if you've got longer term funding agreements, then planning comes a little easier, right? If you just lock into a 3-year or 5-year government contract, you've kind of got not just the money for that, but it lays out what you're going to do to fulfill that. That hopefully does align with the strategy. So I think there's parts that way. So that depends on your funding model. I think if it's and how sophisticated you are. You might have a funding model that's not secure, like donations, which aren't secure, but you're really good at it. You've managed to bring in millions or hundreds or whatever it might be over the years, and you're pretty confident that we can do that. So even if your funding is not secure, you say, yeah, I think we're good enough that we can move out 3-5 years. And especially when you get sort of those big, sort of audacious goal ones, we're going to do a capital campaign. That's sometimes very similar to some of the things that people do. Then you're really pushing it because then it's this idea, we got a strategy. But hell, I'm on a board right now that's raising maybe $3 million, $4 million to build a residential eating disorder place. Our strategy is pretty fluid because it sort of goes up and down. The wins of fundraising, the losses of fundraising when you're not there yet. So that time frame is a lot more fluid. It's hard to lock in what our next strategic steps are because we're in this capital phase, which is, I'm not sure how long that is. It kind of depends on how successful we are. So it's not a great answer, but it kind of a bit fluid in that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay, well, yeah, I think those are only, before we lose too many people with the hour nearing, let's just close this off then. So before we get into any further resources that you might be interested in, I'd just like to thank everyone for joining us today. We did have a really good turnout, and I'm quite pleased about that. And if you have any thoughts on any further topics you'd like us to explore, we often inform our offerings directly from our evaluation surveys. So I put that evaluation survey link in the chat, and if you are interested in keeping up with more workshops like this, I also linked our website, and the workshop thing is right underneath. So a couple of workshops you might be interested in just over a week, we have our session on strategic risk management, hosted by Mike again, as well as our risk management expert, Leslie Tamagi. And last I checked, I think there was only 2 more spots for this really in-depth 3-hour workshop. So do check that out on our website. And next in our intro series, we also have intro and financials. Included in that series, we have one on governance, and we have one on fundraising and social enterprise. So again, you can keep in touch with those newsletters, our workshops through our newsletter, and you can sign up on our website. And that's about it. We have another one. If you would like any more support for your organization from, one nonprofit to another, our website is the best place to start looking for that type of support. Thank you all for joining, and you'll hear from me in a couple hours with a bunch of resources and a bunch of downloads for you. So thanks.
Thanks, folks. Take care.